Thank you all for joining us this evening. On behalf of Marin Conservation League, I'd like to welcome you to Workshop 3 of Marin Conservation League's 4-part series, Ranching in the Park, Not by Accident. I'm Kate Powers, the president of MCL. Tonight's workshop is titled Doing It All, Taking Care of the Ranch and the Land, and we have 4 wonderful presenters this evening who will discuss the natural history of the seashore, how the park's mandates are designed to protect its resources, and how ranch management practices can protect watersheds and sensitive species and conserve soil on the lands that the ranchers are stewarding in the park. As you know, Marin Conservation League supports ranching in the pastoral zone of Point Reyes National Seashore and has a long history of doing so, going back to the days of our founders and continuing through the time of the seashore's formation. These ranch workshops spun out of the work of Marin Conservation League's Agricultural Land Use Committee and are the work of MCL Board Directors Sally Gale in the back and David Lewis. They are intended to provide information to our membership and to the public in anticipation of the release of the Seashore's Comprehensive Ranch Management Plan and its corresponding environmental assessment. The series is focused on the working landscapes in the park, how agriculture has historically shaped the landscapes of the seashore, and how the seashore has shaped agriculture, how they have evolved together over time, and how the integrity of the natural areas are maintained. Our 4th and final workshop, 2 weeks from today at Nicasio School, will explore what the future may hold for the next generation of ranchers in the park. The intent of these workshops is to move from general assumptions about these topics to a more specific and informed understanding about these important issues facing this beloved part of our county. David Lewis is the moderator and host for these workshops. David.
Kate, thank you. And in addition to being president, you're the incredible manager of audiovisual equipment, including what I want to point out is that Kate organized having CM Television here to film the talks. And so that's one thing to let you all know is that if you didn't make the first 2, they've been captured. We're going to put it together through an MCL resource in partnership with CM Television. And again, we hope you'll come to the 4th one, but that will also be captured. So, Kate, thank you for all the AV work. It means a lot. So let's get started. And a little bit about format tonight. We have 4 speakers. I'll introduce each speaker as they come up. We'll have a little time to ask them some specific questions. And then as we get through all 4 speakers, we'll ask them to come on up to a table and we'll just have some open question and answer with you. And I think you're going to quickly see how they build on each other. They've had a chance to work together a little bit and share some questions and share what they're going to cover. And so I'm really looking forward to what I'm going to learn tonight, and I hope you'll enjoy and see what we've planned for you is hits the mark. So let's start with Professor Joe Mueller from the College of Marin. There's lots of things to say about Joe. I hope I can be informal here tonight with all the speakers. He's been teaching at College of Marin for 28 years, is largely responsible for its natural history program, including 15 different courses. And I think the other reason that we're really grateful to have him here, and he's going to share with us the natural history of the seashore and really help us all understand why it's so special from a natural resource perspective and the natural history. But why it's so great to have him do that for us is it's really been his backyard for a long time, and he knows it very intimately. And that sense of place isn't something you can replace with an academic degree. So we're really grateful to have him here, to have him walk us through the natural history of the seashore. So Joe, thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Nice to see you all. I know many of you, and it's always great to have familiar faces out there. Let me tell you a little bit about what I plan to do. This is a talk that takes a field ecology course and slims it down into about a half an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take various topics that would normally take, hour and a half or maybe even up to 2 hours, and kind of slim them down to 5 minutes, kind of the main points. And I'm going to try and tie it all together. College instructors not only are interested in sharing some of the details and some of the science here, but most importantly, I think, they share perspective. And so what you're going to get tonight from me is an ecologist's perspective. And we're trained to look at interrelationships. All right, we live in the Western culture is trained a little differently. And sometimes some of the stuff gets a little edgy. I'm sure you've noticed because we're kind of trained to look at things by reducing them into little parts and kind of box them off from each other. But ecologists and many biologists have noticed that things are more interconnected than we often think. And so keep that in mind when we're looking at this together. What's the ecological perspective? What's the ecologist perspective? And what kind of conclusions do we draw when we look at things like that? Okay, so kind of questions. Is this working okay here? Yeah. The kinds of questions that ecologists ask are, well, first of all, ecologists would ask herself, what are the physical variables? What are the non-living variables that set the stage for life in a particular area? They call these abiotic. And what we're interested here is mostly climate. And we're going to see climate's really amazingly unique here. And why is there such high diversity? What's makes this place such so special, looking at those interconnections? And what are those interrelationships? And when we put this all together, it often weaves a unique perspective, of which I want to share with you tonight. So this is the first thing I'd just like to show you, is that in a relatively small area, there's a lot of different plant communities. And ecologists are really interested in plant communities because they're the ones that are able to take the energy in the light, non-living form and package it into a chemical, usable form for the rest of life. And so conditions that are good for them are conditions that are good for everything else when you're looking at wild systems, when you're looking at natural systems. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that this place is incredibly diverse. There aren't many places like this that are so diverse in relatively small areas. And what am I doing here? So, went ahead of myself. Which one's doing what? Sorry, it just flipped 4 in a row there. So you got the whole thing right there. That's half of it. Yeah, so let's see. Okay, just one little, okay, there we go. First thing to keep in mind, it was one of the first things, I take a class out to Point Reyes, the first thing we talk about is that there are 3 seasons out there, really. We're all used to winter, spring, summer, and autumn, but a lot of ecologists would agree that the 3 maritime seasons are more important out there to the living creatures, to the ecological framework than those 4 that we're all used to. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about those. The one that has most of an effect, and the one that is quite central, and it's also the longest. This is the one that's from March through maybe August, sometimes September. Sometimes these seasons can be longer, sometimes they can be shorter, but that's a good average time. And I'll talk about each one really briefly. We call that the upwelling period. And upwelling, if somebody had to say, what is one of the most important things that set the stage for life in this particular area, I would say it's upwelling, because it has a lot to do with fog, it has a lot to do with nutrients, it has a lot to do with just overall temperature. What it does is it tempers the area, so it doesn't get too hot and too cold. And that's a really important point. And if we take a look at how it works, it turns out that there are these winds in the spring that come from the northwest. As you know, winds are named for where they're coming from, and currents are named for where they're going to, which is a little confusing, right? And what these winds do is they become pretty constant because of pressure differential in the Central Valley. And what they do is they set the surface waters into motion. When they set them into motion and you have a spinning earth under them, the surface waters are going to move offshore. Well, physically, the only thing that can possibly happen if you have if you have surface waters moving offshore is either a big empty trough or cold, nutrient-rich waters coming up to replace them. And that's important because nutrients sink because of gravity, and light doesn't get down very deep. So that's the magic for any productivity in any aquatic system, getting nutrients to where light is. And this area does it really well. And that's what that is all about. All those red areas there is all about upwelling. So where there is upwelling in aquatic systems on this planet, whether it be a lake or whether it be ocean surface, tends to be on western sides of continents, you've got productivity. So that is big. Now, pointing it the wrong way. So there's also a time in fall where all of this subsides. The plankton mostly dies off, the waters become clear, they warm up a bit. It's called the oceanic season. The winds cease. If you live out there, it's a wonderful time. I live out there and it's just, you just can't wait for the fall because of course the fog, not as much fog. You don't have to worry about all the spring winds, all right? So it's kind of middle between both of these, all right? And then in the wintertime, you have this Davidson countercurrent that's going to start coming up from the south, and that changes things drastically as well. It brings warmer water, relatively warmer water along the coast. So again, when the cooler air temperatures, relatively warmer water, and that again kind of tempers everything. So that's a really important point as far as this peninsula is concerned. It's very temperate. Yeah, the extremes are all modified, and that's a really important thing for life and diversity. If there was one other climatic thing that I would point out that is really important is that when the northern face of our planet starts to inch its way towards the sun, we call that spring, and then on into summer, it turns out that there's this high pressure system here, and you can see it here in July and here in January. Very subsident, very low and south off of Baja here. But look what happens here in summer. It sits about 1,000 miles off of our coast here, and it deflects storms. And what this does is it sets up the situation for what geographers call, and meteorologists call, a Mediterranean climate. There aren't many Mediterranean climates in the world, but having dry summers is significant for ecological systems. It has a lot to do with decomposition rates. It has a lot to do with how fire evolves. It has a lot to do with plant productivity rates and all kinds of other things. If we take a look at the world, for instance, and look at Mediterranean climates, there's not a lot of them. And you might notice this is where our species grew up. So this is not only a really great place for human beings to live because it's more comfortable than a lot of other places because of the lack of extremes, right? Ecologically, it's important because of those dry summers. So most of these areas on the planet that we look at, I visited them all because I'm really interested in seeing. It's really fun to go here and look at all the plants that have taken over here and where they actually try to live in, eke out an existence there. Ice plant in South Africa, it never gets this big as like a chair because it has all this competition. Here it just takes over. Yeah. And so, where you take plants from similar kinds of climates into other areas, they thrive because of the climate, but the usual limits and controls aren't there and they take over. And that's probably one of the most significant factors that we would want to think of when we're thinking about taking care of the park, invasives and non-natives. That's ecologically and as apolitically as I can possibly think, but just ecologically and scientifically, that's something you really want to keep in mind. And that's significant with big changes since the 19th century and the changes when Europeans came in. They brought different kinds of plants. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah. So, Mediterranean climate, and just to add another little sprinkle of uniqueness, summer fog. If you look at many of those other Mediterranean climates, they don't have summer fog. This place does. So it has dry summers, a temperate climate, but summer fog. And that is one of the best mixes of recipes for life that you could possibly think of. So that's one of that's in a nutshell the kind of foundation climatically as to why the ecology of Point Reyes is so special. Now, there's one other aspect that makes it special indeed, and that is geology. And we're not going to talk all about the geology here tonight, because we'd have to start defining sedimentary and igneous and metamorphic rocks and all these different things. So all I'm going to do is just kind of shorten it for you. And as you probably already know, this peninsula here is geologically disconnected from the rest of the continent. Right? You all know that, I bet, right? Yeah. So this little fault line here, kind of like a hinge, yeah, this extends all the way out on a plate that goes all the way out into the mid-Atlantic. And then this plate here, the Pacific plate, goes all the way out to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And this one is moving this way at about 2.5 inches a year. They tell me that the average rate of continental landmass movement is about the rate your fingernails grow. They say that the Atlantic Ocean is 8 feet wider than when Columbus passed it. And it wasn't even there when the dinosaurs were around. So this Earth is moving around a lot. Well, this peninsula is interesting because, and we'll leave all the numbers as far as how long ago all these happened, because a lot of that is not really well understood. But this started out as magma within the crust somewhere down south of Baja. And as it was moving north, as it was moving northwest, it went down and subsided and got all this sedimentary rock added to it, because as sediment lands on this kind of backbone of igneous, it kind of grew to a certain degree. It also became pressurized and heated in certain areas, which made particular kinds of metamorphic rocks here. Yeah? And so Jules Evans in his book, and I highly recommend that book if you haven't read it and you're interested in this, Natural History of Point Reyes and UC Press, he calls this the northwesterly migration of a granitic whale, because whales go down and they come up, and they go down and they come up, and this has been down twice, and now it's up for its second time. And when it comes up, it gets weathered and eroded, and when it goes down, it gets sediment laid on it. So you've got all this incredible geological diversity stuck in this one little area of the plate that's exposed into areas that can be weathered and eroded. This is amazing. So look at all this incredible diversity we have, or all these different colors, this igneous spine, one of the flukes of the whale, this all sedimentary here, and metamorphic mixes, pendants. Jules Evans calls those barnacles. Barnacles are relatively small, and they're along for the ride. So what does this have to do with the ecology? Well, it turns out that soil is the interface between all of this life, non-living aspects of the ecological system that we're looking at. It's the interface. And so the geological bedrock is what sets the stage from the non-living side as far as soil development. And that's really important when you're studying the foundations of ecological systems in a particular area. So we've got this incredibly special climate. It's very temperate. It's got this summer fog. It's got these dry summers. And it has a very diverse bedrock mosaic. And you put those all together, and you get yourself a combination of geological and microclimate diversity that is probably par none, like not anything I've ever seen. And like I said, I've been to all of those different Mediterranean climates. And they're a lot more homogeneous than this particular one. So when the ecologists ask the question, what sets the stage for life in this area, those would be the important foundations as far as the non-living side, as far as the non-living variables. So ecologists study these variables in space and time. And that's what we were just talking about there a little bit. Okay? Let's talk about the life part of it. Soil, the interdependent link between the geosphere and the biosphere. The interface. Ecologists are deeply saddened by how little soil, how little press soil gets. It really is the living film of the planet. I highly recommend, and it's actually very well done and fun and enjoyable, a film called Dirt. It's a documentary called Dirt. If you're interested in the profound importance of soil, I highly recommend that. Soil isn't just a bunch of ground up, non-living materials. It's mixed with living organisms. It's mixed with various dead parts of plants and animals. It has all kinds of bacteria. It has all kinds of different fungi. It has all kinds of it has a lot of air and it has a lot of water. It's an incredible mix. And so what it is this interface between the biological world and the abiotic world. So if you're thinking about the ecology of Point Reyes and you're interested in maintaining that, soil would be a place to look. Soil would be a place to look because it's the interface between that. And so when ecologists take a bunch of courses to get through understanding ecological systems, soil is always a big part of that, and it's becoming more and more important in people's minds. You know, there's been a soil paradigm shift relatively recently, especially because we're understanding how important all the microbes are in there. And the climate has a profound effect on the diversity and abundance and ubiquity of the microbes in the various diverse soils in this area too. So soils are key. If there's anything to take away from today that is so important as far as the people world and the ecological natural world, is the interface of soil. Take care of the soil. Yeah. So let's look at that plant community diversity. So I'm about halfway through. We're just right here. Plant community diversity. Oh, look at this. We've got forests that are dependent. They don't even reproduce hardly without fire. It's amazing. That really is very disconcerting to me since I live in the middle of one. And the southern part of the spine, the Douglas fir forest that grows better on the on the sedimentary side of it. Most of Marin's forests are mixed evergreen, and so there's quite a bit of that there in Point Reyes too. Amazingly enough, there aren't redwood groves, as you probably already know, in Point Reyes, for reasons we're not going to get into. Coastal strand is obviously a big important area. It's right on the edge here of it's the beach, the upper beach and the lower uplands there. Northern coastal prairie, of course, that's the area that's in contention to a certain degree as far as nature and human beings are concerned, right? That's the part that we're having most of the effect on. As far as our species is concerned. Northern coastal scrub, of course, that's chaparral. Some people call that, my teacher Al Molina, I always like to mention his name. He is my dear mentor and good friend. He's called this soft chaparral. I like that because it's just little. It has that sense of it's dealing with a bit more moisture, and of course marshlands and salt marsh. We could spend the whole time just talking about how important salt marshes are. The salt marsh feeds the estuaries, and then the tidal flow of the estuaries then feeds the coast. And then the upwelling and the nutrients and the plankton then feeds the estuaries and adds nutrients to the salt marsh. The closer that we look at these systems, the more we find how mutualistically interrelated they are. And this has been relatively recent because most of the way in which we look at things is by separating them and looking them in little parts. But nature just doesn't work that way. But our minds do. So it's kind of gotten us in trouble, I think. That's, again, an ecologist view. There are other views out there. I always have to tell my students that. That's just my view. You're going to go to another class in an hour and you're going to get another view, and another view. So keep in mind perspective. And of course, the riparian forest and freshwater marsh is always important as well for diversity. Yeah. So let's take a look at soil and roots and just kind of talk a little bit about the human ecology of the area, just so we get a sense on to the same degree that we see here. Boy, this thing really So we're going to talk about roots and soil, just so that you're aware of that. First thing is look at soil, how diverse soils are. Soils are diverse because of the bedrock. Soils are diverse because of the climate. Soils are diverse because of the kinds of life. Now, I wasn't able to find the diverse soils in our particular area for an illustration here. As you know, there isn't desert soil there. But what I want you to see here, or what I think would be useful for you to see, is that there's diversity there. Different kinds of soils. And if you look at this grassland soil, it turns out, well, let me give you as an example of some extremes, just to kind of get a sense of this. If you look at tropical rainforest soils, where you have all this biodiversity, we all know how incredible tropical rainforests are. Did you know they have the poorest soils, some of the poorest soils in the world? And that's because the decomposition rates are so high that all of the nutrients are in the life. And when a leaf falls, it gets decomposed before it hits the ground practically. That's an exaggeration, right? So, and then on the other side, in the desert, there's not enough water for there to be much plant productivity, and so you don't get a lot of nutrient buildup there. But grasslands are the Goldilocks of soils because they're right in between having enough water for there to be enough plant productivity, but they're also not too warm and wet to where everything just goes up into life. We have a savings account of nutrients in grassland soils. This is why, of course, most of the ag lands in the world are on grassland soils. We probably want to take care of grassland soils if we're interested in any degree of sustainability, looking at it from an ecological standpoint. Well, it turns out in this area, Europeans, those soils were probably a bit different and were used different from the natural systems than they are today. One thing that all ecologists agree on is that the deeper the roots, the more the soil is going to be improved for many reasons. One good reason today is that these massive roots are really good ways of storing carbon. But when they get deep, it turns out they allow more water and they allow more air and they allow more bacteria and they allow more what's necessary to have really productive soils. So having really rich, deep, complex roots is really important to having these incredible soils that we see in grasslands. And this example here is pretty wimpy. Look at that. I don't know, this is somebody's flower garden or something. I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, that's a technical term, wimpy. Just don't. So root mass makes all the difference. That's an important thing when we're thinking about human ecology and we're thinking about the park and we're thinking about all the different activities that are going on there. Look at the difference of an annual root here and a perennial root in a very closely related plant. Root mass makes all the difference. All right. So when we look at the human ecology, there's about, when you look at go back to the dates, the coastal prairie was converted to rangelands around that time. And what happened with it is the perennials that have the deeper roots, they weren't able to deal with those changes, and on came these annuals. And that changed this area more than anything within the last 100, 200 years. That's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we take care of the park. Whoa, there we go. Every time I point it over there, you get a whole view of what's going on here. So let's take a look. Species richness, when you do the studies there, per square meter, is greater than any in North America. Per square meter, 23 different species of plants. That's incredible. That's phenomenal. Those studies were done in the latter part of the 1970s. So perennials, bunch grass, sod-forming grasses, they are what allow this diversity to maintain itself on these particular soils. So if we think about this, there are certainly, I know there's a lot of effort to bring back these remnant islands at this point of coastal prairie. It's worth noting that these rangelands, which are there today, of course, communities are determined by the grazing pressure and determined by non-native annual grasses. That's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the park, and I'm sure it's important to keep in mind with all the different interests that we have in this room. That's central to understanding human ecology and natural ecology. Those, given the amount of time that I have, if I was just to pick out one important thing and put it on a slide, that would be it, just to keep in mind. This is just ecology. I'm a reporter, no pointing fingers. It's just, that's what's going on. So I'm just going to finish the last little bit here of just kind of going through a little bit of some of the what makes the place special as far as the results of this incredible climate and geology. Yeah, well, look at where it is. It's in the middle of this incredible floristic province here. About 15% of the plants all here are in this one little area. There's an overlap from north to south. Most of them, of course, have come from the north here, maybe about 5–10% from the south. So if you look at that incredible place there that's orange as far as its plant community diversity, Point Reyes is right in the center of it. That's significant. So it results in a patchwork of communities and abundant diversity. So let's take a look at the plants. 900 species of vascular plants. It's my only exclamation point in the whole PowerPoint. Really important. Look at that. Whoa, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, Joe. Are you kidding? 900, are you sure? Yes. 61 plants present at Point Reyes, but not in the rest of Marin. That's pretty significant, huh? Pretty special. Yeah. 50 plants listed as threatened or rare and endangered, and most of this has a lot to do with, of course, invasives that are competing with them ecologically unfairly. I just made that up. Ecologically unfairly. No, I'm just kidding. And then, of course, look at all those non-natives. That, of course, is what has changed since Europeans come here for a wide array of reasons. Things to keep in mind when we think about this incredible patchwork of plant communities, how special it is, and possible threats that are out there as far as sustainability is concerned and keeping soil diversity in mind. Okay, and then to just kind of wrap up, you probably already know this, but there's incredible diversity of bird life there for all kinds of reasons that I have up there. Incredible temperate climate. People come from all over the world to bird this peninsula. And as you know, I don't know what the numbers are for tourists, but this is certainly a big part of that. And I'm not going to go through reptiles and amphibians and all that. Suffice to say, there's a lot of animal diversity on this peninsula as well. 31 species of marine mammals that either pass through or live there. And one of the reasons why they're living there or breeding there is because of its incredible productivity. And we know this because when the productivity drops during particular kinds of years, like El Nino years, and upwelling stops, all these birds aren't able to reproduce. The marine mammals go somewhere else for food. It's incredible. These harbor seals, by the way, they're in a little club because none of the other harbor seals will accept them because they have little signs on their heads there but they come off in the water. But anyway, whale watching, how many people come to, I mean, isn't it an incredible world we live in now? Rather than killing whales, we make hundreds of times more money, maybe even thousands of times more economic growth by watching them. And there are some left. Yeah. I mean, if you think about that, what did they say? A lion in Africa dead is worth something like $15,000, but alive it's worth $150,000 because of all the people that come to see it. And that's what's happened at Point Reyes. People come to see this stuff. They bring money in. It's incredible. And then this is my second to last one because I really like the idea here. 50 species of native terrestrial mammals and just the sense of perspective here. I was amazed. I brought a class to Yellowstone this last summer, and I was amazed. We would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to see wolves, and we found packs of wolves and something incredible. And just looking around me and seeing hundreds and hundreds of people getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, teenagers getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. They go to bed at 3, right? And they're getting up to see wolves, and that's all they want to see is wolves. And thousands of people all over the world, they want to see wolves. Yet right outside of the park, it's the exact opposite. And the people that are outside the park that live there are as thrilled as possible if they can kill one. Wow. It really got me. It's like, whoa, that's really kind of strange. And to a certain degree, we have the same with our predators in our areas. It's this attitude about these parts of nature. I highly recommend looking at trophic cascades. We now know the wolf has changed Yellowstone in a significant way. It's changed the rivers, it's changed the riparian corridors, it's changed the beavers, it's changed like everything. Since 1995, Yellowstone is a completely different park. And I bet you anything with the coyotes coming back into Point Reyes, there'll be some differences as well here. And I don't think it's been studied to my knowledge, and the bobcat there. And my last creature here I would like to talk about that I think is a great advertiser of perspective, and I'm right on time, look at that, is the gopher. He's a great example of this difference. Now, if you ask most people about what they think about gophers, they'll tell you, well, come look at my traps over here, all these things here, because I hate gophers. They compete with me, they eat my flowers, and they put these awful piles of dirt on my lawn. Right? But if you look at the gopher ecologically, and you think about the Central Valley soils, it turns out gophers have been rototilling and plowing and keeping the soils of the Central Valley to their very best for millions of years. The economy of California wouldn't be anything what it is today if it wasn't for gophers. Because gophers turn it over, they aerate it, they allow the bacteria to mix with it, they allow all this stuff to mix with it. I think we need a gopher on the flag, not a bear that we killed the last one in 1922. The bear saw us, oh, there's a reminder, look, 1922, Bakersfield, last one. Huh? So perspective, looking at things ecologically, can really turn things around. Seriously, this would be a different state. How much food does this state grow? And if it wasn't for gophers, it wouldn't be anything close. Yet how do we usually think about gophers? We think about them in a reductionist way. We think about them with borders. We think about them and how they relate to us individually. But we don't make the connections between the ag lands and the economy and the soils and the climate and all of that the ecologists do. So part of what I'm sharing with you here is the idea of perspective. And my last slide, and I'm actually a minute early, my last slide is a wonderful visual of perspective. I'll just let you think about that on your own. When it comes to teaching environmental science for 25 years, and if somebody said, what is the central environmental problem that we have for our future and sustainability? If you asked me personally, I would tell you it's because we think this way, but the world works this way. Perspective. So I just wanted to leave you with that, and I hope this is what you came to listen to. Thanks.
A couple questions for Joe. If anybody has any specific ones about his talk.
About gophers? No, just kidding.
I was interested in the idea of the 3 maritime seasons, and you mentioned November to March, and you mentioned March to September, October, but the third one was...
That's oceanic, and that's September, October. So average would be upwelling, and again, can be a month or two on either side, but average would be March to August, and then oceanic season, when everything kind of drops off, would be September and October, and then the Davis and countercurrent season is easy to remember because it's pretty much the winter, and there's, of course, all kinds of other things that change then too, like salinity drops and turbidity increases, so light can't get down because of the rain, when we used to have rain back in the old days. When you think about this too, you want to think about climate change, I think also, because all of this stability that I'm talking about here is changing all over the world. And that's putting incredible pressure on poorer people and on ecological systems. Yeah.
So this will be our last one for Joe, and then we'll bring him back up with the full panel.
David.
Hey,
How
Joe.
you doing, David? Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. What's your perspective about human ability to recreate healthy ecosystems, ecology, given that we've,
Well, that seems.
one way or another, done a lot to change
Yeah,
the circumstances, and so now we sort of have to manage it, or we can't sort of not manage it because we can't go away? What's your perspective of it?
Just from what I can gather, this seems to be the manifestation of this difference as far as when I see different people thinking about stuff. There's one side that says, don't worry about any problems with nature. We'll use this neocortex to figure it all out and change it so it works best. And then there's the ecological side that says, no, we have to conform to it. It's the boss. When you look at both sides, ecology has physics and chemistry and all of those immutable laws on its side. And so when you ask an ecologist this, it's usually doubtful that we can make things better than they were originally. But of course we can make things better than they are now, because we can try to work with going back to the way it was, to whatever degree that is. That's, I know, kind of a Trumpy answer, but this could be a new verb.
I'll take the mic as moderator. No, just keep us on schedule. Joe, thank you very much. Very, very much. Thank you. So next we have Frank Dean to take us through a little bit of the context of what it's like to have a seashore that's challenged with multiple mandates, and how does it do that. Frank comes to us as the president of the Yosemite Conservancy, but I think many of you know that he has a long history in Marin, both as assistant superintendent for the Point Reyes National Seashore, and then later on as the superintendent for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So he really has a command of this topic. We're really lucky that today worked out for your schedule. I know other days maybe wouldn't, but we're glad that you said yes and that you could come today. And just thank you. You're a community member, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, David. Well, it's great to be with you here tonight. I know we're competing against the giants, and I'm following a professional lecturer here, so hopefully this goes well. Let me see if I get this down here. This way. Got it. So, obviously we have, a beautiful place, and we heard from Joe about the resources. Seems to be fading now. Okay. So obviously a mix of pastoral zone and hay being grown amidst the former dune system there along the beach. Oops. Okay, here we go, some context. So, there was Frederick Law Olmsted, who you might know of, who had something to do with Central Park and Yosemite, was commissioned by the state of California in 1929 to inspect and do some reports on the vanishing coastline because of development. And this is a state report. He actually did study Point Reyes as an area that should be protected. But back then it was, we didn't know as much as Joe knows and his colleagues know about the resource. It was really more about the scenery, the natural beauty. And so it took a while, but initially the Park Service rejected the notion of Point Reyes becoming a seashore. It took a while because of the ranching, ironically, because there was a pretty tight filter back in those days. They also rejected Tahoe in the 1930s because they thought it was already too developed. So, their thinking evolves. They also rejected Mount Tam State Park, as we know it now, because of the reservoir that William Kent wanted to put in for the town of Stinson Beach. So this was right after the Hetch Hetchy was constructed in Yosemite. So they had fairly high standards about sort of purity and what these parks in their mind should be. But obviously, as the coastline continued to be developed, they rethought Point Reyes and figured out a way to include the ranches in the 1962 legislation. Now that legislation has been amended a couple of times. Here we go. Boy, this has got a hair trigger. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. All right, so the complex mission of the park is preserve and protect park resources and the natural and cultural and historic resources as well. The ongoing land uses contribute to the historic character of the park and its resources, and that includes ranches. And again, you see the context. There's the McClure Ranch here and the natural beauty surrounding it. So what's included in the park? Well, in addition to all the wonderful resources that Joe described and the unique situation, location that it occupies, national park law does apply to the seashore. And so even though it's called the Point Reyes National Seashore, the same laws and regulations and policies apply as they would at Yosemite National Park or Redwood National Park, Death Valley for that matter. So it's the same. The policies are the same across the national parks. The legislation, however, is unique to each park, as are the resources to each park. Each park is considered nationally significant or unique in its own right, and that's why it was created by Congress. The Redwood Act that I mentioned there in the first bullet was 1978 law that basically said that all the parks would be the same. There's not a Gettysburg, which is a cannonball park in Park Service parlance, is really treated the same. The resources there are considered the same from a policy standpoint as Yosemite or Point Reyes. National Environmental Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, National Historic Preservation Act, all those key laws apply. And Joe mentioned the endangered species. It has, Point Reyes is in the top 10 among national park units in the country as far as the amount of threatened and endangered species that it has within its boundaries. Golden Gate's number 1, by the way, just saying, but Point Reyes in the top 10. And the reason that is because of the impacts over time, particularly Golden Gate, it's remnant habitat. You think about the rich ecological location that Joe described so well, but you have an urban center at Golden Gate and much of that land, so you have pockets of habitat and species intact. And Point Reyes has more of that because it's more intact. Other things that apply to the park's decision-making and mandates are the master plan, the general management plan, rare plants and animals, and water quality, and invasive non-native species, when there's a lot of those, as Joe also mentioned. Public access is also key. It was set aside for its scenic values and resources, so the whole thing about getting people out there and enjoying the park was also a big part of the park's mission. Visual impacts from whatever the park is doing as far as its management, including ranches, is also something that we used to hear about when I was there. And the care of the ranch facilities themselves, many of which are historic, and that's also a big thing that the park focuses on, to try and retain an historic barn versus putting a metal roof on the barn or tearing the barn down and replacing it with a temporary or a steel structure. All those things are factored into the management and the care and preservation of the park, along with the ranching families. Okay. You want to just advance it if you can? Yeah, just do it. Okay. I was asked about this one. What's the difference between inside and outside the park? Do the ranches have higher standards within the park? Yes, they do. That's pretty clear. And the big difference is the process required to evaluate and issue the authorization to do something. So if you own your own ranch in West Marin on private land and you want to plant a crop to increase the production on the acreage, you pretty much can do it as a landowner. You might need some permits from the county, but you pretty much can do it. The fact that the land in the park is owned by the federal government and it's leased back or permitted back to the ranchers, and then all the resources that Joe described that are there, the sensitive species, the water quality issues, all those kinds of requests to do something on the land, change the stocking rate of cows or whatever, to build a barn, whatever, all that is reviewed, not just by the Park Service, but there's a lot of eyes that look at these kinds of decisions, particularly since the mid-90s. Go ahead. You need to go back. Sorry, guys. Okay. This is just a scenic shot that shows Abbott's Lagoon there in the top center, and then the McClure Ranch next to it. And just again, the context, the contrast, or the adjacency of the park resources. Abbott's Lagoon is one of the park's prime resources and habitat areas, and then the great beach behind it, and then the ranch, all coexisting there. For better or for worse, they're all together. So how's it going? Hope I didn't skip something there. Okay. How's it going? Well, over 50 years, the ranching families have evolved, and we're now in the second and third generation permits and families. The uncertainty of the lease permits and the tenure and the bureaucracy does have some bearing on the uncertainty. That's why we're here tonight. But yet they're there. The families are there. There is a pretty stable presence in the park. And other issues come and go or emerge. The quarries that were, the use of quarrying for rock and fill material was terminated when I was there in the 90s. But now we have tule elk that are creating a conflict on the grazing and lands. But the park made the decision years ago to release some of the elk into free range mode, and they did free range back into the pastoral zone. So and that's an issue that hopefully will be resolved with the management planning and the permits that are in question. So one thing I wanted to say is that we have critical mass. Despite the uncertainties, the ranches are a significant percentage of the remaining ag production in Marin County. Really, the most of the dairies in the county are within the park. We're fortunate to have this land preserved from development, and I think the park would not happen today because of the funding, the cost of purchasing the land, and just the legislative impasse of getting anything through Congress these days. It wouldn't occur. The coalition of ranchers and environmental groups that came together and put their heads together in the early 60s really is a model that helped them get the park established and created. And hopefully that is one that will help carry through the issues before us today in this era. And I hope that we can also just appreciate the bigger picture and find a way to continue to make it all work. I think I might have skipped over a slide, so I'm going to go back on one. Boy. I'm going to come over and just toggle through so I can get to that one slide before I make you guys go crazy here. Okay, that's the one. So inside and outside the park, I was starting to talk about that. I had a second slide here. So one of the things that the park does to manage the park lands and look out for issues of concern is they do have a range program. So there's a range specialist and an assistant technician that works with the ranchers on a daily basis. And they help them with permits that they might need for projects or ideas that would actually improve water quality, reduce erosion, and basically steer clear of rare plants. So those are projects that the park monitors. You don't have that level of scrutiny outside the park as you would inside the park. And they do monitor the water quality, endangered species, and also residual dry matter. So at the end of the season, they take clippings and they determine how intensively was the land grazed and should it be adjusted in the future. They do have lease permits with conditions for the ranches. And again, those are more significant, much more significant than you would with a tenant farmer outside the park or rancher outside the park. The rent is established at fair market value for ranches that have facilities like a dairy, and those are determined by appraisals. And they also have, the rents are adjusted because of all of the aforementioned bureaucracy and oversight that I described so far. If it's just a beef cattle ranch, AUMs is how they determine the rates that they would charge for the rancher. And again, there's public access required or allowed on most of the ranch lands. You can walk through those fields unlike private land, so that is the other key difference. I think we covered the slides. Yeah. Yep. That's it. So any questions for me while I'm up here and we have a panel? We could just go on the last one's just questions.
I have a question on public access. What determines whether the degree of public access? Because I noticed there are some areas that don't have public access even though they have roads going into them. Is there a determination for that?
Yeah, I think the park tries to strike a balance of where the public should go or be most likely to be interested in going. It's like coastal access to the beaches or like Abbott's Lagoon or good natural either scenery or wildlife areas. There is some attempt to obviously respect the privacy of the families around the ranch complexes, and quite honestly, they're not the most attractive for the casual visitor to want to go see, and so they're just so the interference. But I mean, technically they are open to the public, and you can knock on their door and ask questions. But but that's not the common practice, yeah. Yes, hi.
The National Seashore and most of the public agencies in West Marin are part of the Golden Gate International UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. I never hear that mentioned. I would like you to explain to this audience how that works and if there's any benefit or potential benefit to us to cooperate with other biosphere reserves that have the same problems. I can mention two.
Okay. So the Central Coast Biosphere Reserve, the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve, was established, I believe, in the 1990s, early 2000s. 84, sorry. So I'm a little rusty in some of this, but I was going to a lot of meetings on this in the 90s, and to be candid, it's a fairly moribund program. They're the agencies that comprise the Biosphere Reserve, which extends from the Stanford University properties, the sort of the wilder lands that they have along the 280 corridor, up to the Point Reyes area, and it includes the marine sanctuaries offshore. So we used to meet quarterly, and we had discussions about what was this, at that time, relatively new designation. What did it mean? How were we going to manage it or coordinate? But as far as I know, those meetings, sort of faded away as some people left. It was really, it's a real designation, and the resources that, we heard just a description of this zone here, this region from Joe, but all the different agencies that comprise this broader zone, they all get along, but it's not like, we're meeting regularly intently from an ecosystem standpoint. So it's a good question. I don't know the United Nations, program, what it brings to the table. It is an honorary designation, a recognition of the significance of the site, but there's not teeth to it or
There was actually a cooperative effort from 1990 to 1994, which you probably know about, where the Izor Biosphere Reserve in Brittany, which had the same problems, cooperated with GGNRA for 4 years.
I'm not familiar with that one. Sorry, I don't know it.
So I'm gonna
Yeah.
turn to our next speaker. I want to ask you to thank Frank. So as I bring up our next speaker, let me just kind of help you build the thread a little bit. Again, want to thank Joe for building the context for us on the natural history and the ecology of Point Reyes National Seashore, and then asking Frank here to give us the context of how a seashore, a national park, and its staff work to manage that ecology and have a working landscape and agriculture on a seashore that was intended all along to have that dual purpose, those dual objectives, and how they could be integrated and achieved. Frank hinted did more than hint. He really listed for you the environmental regulations that are part of a national park and what are required. We have here, we could go down any one of those threads tonight, but we have here tonight with us Lori Tull from the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board to help us really understand water quality regulation and how the Clean Water Act and then what's known as the Port of Cologne Act here in California is implemented on a place like the seashore with a federal partner like the National Seashore and the National Park Service. So with that, I want to say thank you to Lori. She comes to us with a master's in environmental science. She's 23 years of experience with the regional board. Actually has a bachelor's in animal science that I didn't know about until we invited her to speak. And has been involved with the San Francisco board's development of their confined animal regulations and also in association with their grazing regulations. So thank you, Lori, for being here. And our last bit is that her manager, Jim Ponton, is here as well. So look forward to speaking with him afterward, as I think we get a chance.
I'm going to try and have Jim do this, push the buttons that seem to want to keep going on and on. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So I have a lot of material to cover. I'm going to try to clip through my slides as fast as I can. It's hard to distill so much information down. They wanted me to talk about 20 minutes. It might go over, I warn you. So first slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about who we are, the Water Board, and what we do. We are the state agency responsible for protecting water quality, surface waters and groundwaters, and also the beneficial uses of those waters. We have 9 regional boards throughout the state. You are in Region 2, and this slide, it's kind of hard to see the outline, but you can kind of get a sense of our boundary. It's mostly the Bay Area. Our agency implements and enforces a variety of different water quality programs, not just ag-related programs. We regulate wastewater treatment plants, large industrial discharges, landfills, groundwater remediation, lots of different areas. But today we're going to talk about grazing and confinement facilities. Our authorities come from the Federal Clean Water Act, our California Water Quality Control Act, and also our Basin Plan. And when we talk about confinement facilities and we talk about grazing, we're implementing federal regulations and state regulations, and also our Basin Plan as well. Okay. So the Clean Water Act requires us, in addition to enforcing existing regulations, we are required as states to look at our waters and see if they're meeting our state standards. And if they're not, we're required to designate them as impaired. And once a water body is designated as impaired by a particular pollutant, it triggers the process for us developing what's called a total maximum daily load. And we call them TMDLs. And in a nutshell, it's just an action plan that has the goal of attaining the water quality standards in a certain water body. So within our region, within the Region 2, we have currently 17 completed TMDLs. 6 of them are also being developed, 6 additional TMDLs. But within the Tomales Bay watershed, we have 4 that have been completed. We have 1 for pathogens for the Tomales Bay, and that is signified by the blue outline with the Tomales Bay watershed. We have a sediment TMDL for the Lagunitas Creek watershed, and 2 mercury TMDLs, 1 for Walker Creek watershed and the Tomales Bay. So each of these plans requires the regions to address the pollutant sources that have been identified when these plans were put together. And this is an example of the Tomales Bay pathogen TMDL and the sources that were identified in that plan. And today I'm going to talk about what we're doing to address the grazing, the dairies, and the equestrian facilities. And I'm mostly going to talk about our program as a whole for our region, but I'm going to try to focus it in on this area since this is what we're talking about today. So here in Region 2, we use conditional waiver of WDRs for grazing and also for our dairies. We have 2 conditional waivers of WDRs, which are waste discharge requirements for grazing. 1 is for Tomales Bay, and 1 covers both the Napa River and the Sonoma Creek watersheds. And then we recently revised our general conditional waiver of WDRs for dairies last year. And we also have a general WDR that we just recently revised this last June. We updated it and revised it. And that one is for not just dairies, but for all types of confinement facilities. So the one thing about a conditional waiver, it sounds like, I want to kind of clarify, it sounds like you're waiving requirements, and really that's not the case. A conditional waiver to us is, it's on? There we go. Conditional waiver is really just one of our regulatory tools in our toolbox. And it fits certain situations, and we'd like to use it for grazing and also for our dairies. We've used it since 2003 for the dairies, and more recently for the grazing activities. But the big benefit by using conditional waiver is that in order to qualify, you have to show that you're meeting certain standards. So these facilities that qualify for a conditional waiver are usually in a lower risk category for water quality risk. And to date, it's one of the big benefits that it hasn't required a fee, an annual fee. So it's helped to funnel the funds towards on the ground improvements and also just implementing the requirements of the program. So let's see. We have the dairy waiver, and then we have the general WDR, and then we're going to talk about these in more detail as we go. So just to start off with the grazing program. in Tomales Bay. It was adopted in 2008 and then expired and was renewed in 2013. It implements our TMDLs in the area. And out of 108,000 acres of rangeland, about 2/3 of that is currently covered by the waiver, with about 99 owners or operators enrolled in the program. And within, let's see, between 2015 and 16, we've done about 31 ranch inspections. And as far as our inspector could see, is that there were no major enforcement issues during that time. And he did notice that a lot of people were modifying their practices based on the drought, and that they were reducing their herds or using rotational procedures to help with the fields, but no major enforcement issues. So there's not a lot to be eligible for the waiver, but the major thing is you have to be within the Tomales Bay watershed, have 50 acres or more of grazing lands, and the animals must forage for 45 days or more to be qualified as grazing lands. And then we have the option of bringing in smaller parcels that have been grazed if they pose a threat to water quality. So, under the grazing waiver, the ranchers must assess their pastures and determine whether or not they need to have improved measures to protect water quality. And these measures must be put into their ranch water quality plan. And then they have a schedule for improvement if they are going to be doing projects, and that's all in the plan. And they have year-round managing of these. They use the plan a year-round, and there's just some things there that you might see that they're going to do. They're assessing their streams. They're going to be looking at their pastures. They might decide that they need to provide off-stream water because they're going to be fencing that riparian corridor to keep the animals out. And all of this is going to be put in their plan, and they're going to have a schedule for improvement. Then annually, they're going to be monitoring their RDM, and they submit to us an annual certification that shows us what the results are for their RDM monitoring and also how they're doing on their schedule. So I'd like to review now. There's a lot here, but we'll do it kind of quickly. The Confined Animal Facility Program. So like I said before, we have the conditional waiver just for dairies, and then we have the new general WDR. And this program started in 2003. So the dairies have been complying with it since 2003. And it also implements our CAF regulations and our TMDLs. Currently, we have about 43 producers enrolled in the waiver region-wide. 6 of those are in the park. And then I'm going to talk a little more in detail about what's required of them, specifically under the waiver, and also about the new general WDR, which is going to be bringing in new types. Sorry, I guess it's better right here. It will also be bringing in not just dairies, but other types of animal facilities, such as horses. So both the waiver and the general WDR are implementing our state regs. And our state regs are really minimum standards, and our program builds upon these standards. And so I just wanted to go through them so you have a sense of what the basics are. So the state regs say that, yeah, that's a good idea. Is that okay? Can I? Keep it steady. I'll try. If it starts to, okay, tell me if I need to throw it down. So, all right. So, confined animal facilities need to divert all their stormwater away from their confined areas. They need to contain their animal waste and stormwater contacting the animal waste. And then there's also requirements for how solids and liquids are applied to pastures and croplands. They must keep animals out of the creeks within their confined area, and they must protect groundwater. So the minimum standards are very minimum. Our permits and our waiver is much more extensive. It makes them do a lot of planning, these are the basics. They need to contain their manure, contain their waste, and contain any stormwater contacting the areas of the animals and the areas with the waste. Yeah. Okay, great. So the dairy waiver in general covers the management of processed water, manure, stormwater, and other waste streams at the site. So if they do a cheese making operation, that's also included in their planning and in their implementation of management plans. Or if they have, that's, okay. Testing. Okay, thank you. So this slide just summarizes, just so you have a snapshot of what's required of a dairyman under the waiver. Our waiver was adopted last year. All of them enrolled as of September of last year. This year, they're completing a new monitoring and reporting program. And this will be our first year that they'll be taking surface water samples and also groundwater samples on each dairy. They have the option to participate in a group watershed monitoring effort, and most of them have opted to do that. The following year, they have to update the waste management plan, and they also, if they have grazing over 50 acres, they have to have a grazing management plan that's consistent with the grazing waiver requirements. And that is new for the dairies. And then also what is new, by 2019, they all have to have individual nutrient management plans on site if they apply manure, solid or liquid, to land. And then in 2020, the waiver will expire. Waivers last for a 5-year period. And so this is part of the reason why we have this time, we have a general WDR that applies to all different types of facilities. And I'll go over that at the end, how we have a tiered system in that WDR. When the waiver expires for the dairies, they will fold into our WDR into their own tier. And we won't be renewing the waiver every 5 years. And they'll have the same requirements, just one permit for everybody. So just go over a little bit. I'm going to go over just a little detail of each of those elements of the waiver. And first, the water quality monitoring and reporting. So like I said, they're going to have to do groundwater sampling on site. Surface water sampling, either if they choose to participate in a group, or if not, they can do their own. And they'll have to measure residual dry matter annually, and then they'll be reporting to us annually. So the waste management plan is all of them, most of the dairies already have one because they've been under the waiver since 2003, which also required to have a waste management plan. But the revised waiver will require them to update it. Excuse me. And it includes pollution prevention measures, management measures, everything that has to do with the production area of a facility. And then they're required to have calculations in there to make sure that they have enough retention capacity to hold all the stormwater that contacts any area that has animals or manure. So they have to go back. Right now, they're going through workshops with the Dairy Quality Assurance Program to make sure their calculations are correct and that they have adequate capacity, but they have to include that in their plan. They also have to have an emergency contingency plan in case there's more rain than the ponds are designed to hold. They have to include other activities on site that prior to this new waiver and the new WTR, it may have required a separate permit, say cheese making waste, or some folks might do on-site slaughter for different types of confined animal facilities, maybe not a dairy. But those activities also has to be included in this management plan. This is a really good example of a structural improvement that one dairy made in order to qualify for waiver coverage back in 2003. I could just, there we go. The middle, right? There we go. So here's the before shot, of course. So this is a travel lane for the cows to come from the pasture into the milk barn. We have a milk barn on this side, and we have the creek that ran right along the edge of this fence. And during rainstorm, as you can see, it would flow directly into the creek. This is the after, which is a huge improvement. We have berms on both sides. It's completely concrete, but the creek is protected. It's very easy for them to get in and clean this out before a storm, and also it's sloped so that it directs any runoff to this pond. So this is a kind of a typical improvement. And a lot of the facilities, in order to qualify for coverage back in 2003, quite a few dairies made similar improvements to this. Oh, sorry. Trying to get So the last component of the waiver and of the requirements for the dairies are that they have to develop a nutrient management plan. This is new. It's basically a nutrient budget for any solid or liquid waste that goes onto the land. The statewide standard requires that if you put liquid or solid waste onto land, you have to do it at an economic rate, which means that you're not overloading the land, that you're doing it for the amount of nutrients that are going onto the land. The crop is going to uptake the nutrients, and you're not going to have anything running off. So they're going to have to go through quite an extensive procedure to take samples of the soil, take samples of the crops, and to determine if they're meeting their budget. Part of the nutrient plan, a key element of the nutrient management plan also is that there are setbacks, setback requirements in the waiver for how close you can be to a waterway when you're applying waste. So now we're moving on to the general WDR. So this is a permit, and this is a permit that will not expire, and which is a good thing in a way, because we tried to really do it right the first time, and we don't have to go back in and redo it. And it also provides some continuing, some consistency in the future. But we made an effort to try to have a program that met different needs and also was practical and also mindful of costs. But we have 3 tiers to this program. Our tier 1 is going to be for facilities that are new to the program and also do not utilize waste retention ponds. So they will not have to have such an extensive waste management plan. They can have a more, we're calling it a ranch water quality plan, which is kind of like a waste management plan light. But this is where like most of the horse boarding facilities would fall in tier 1. Tier 2 is for our dairies when they come in 2020, when the waiver expires. And tier 3 is reserved for facilities that need a little more oversight. They can't certify, they meet the requirements now, and might need some structural improvements and a schedule for improvement. And if a facility falls into tier 3, then they have to hire a professional to help them with their plans. They have to submit their plans to us for review, and they cannot participate in a group monitoring effort. They have to do their own monitoring on site. And there are some criteria for getting out of tier 3 once you've made some improvements, but it's basically for those facilities that have big issues. Fortunately, we don't have, we have 2 facilities, and they're not in Tongass Bay watershed, that would be falling in this tier right now. Most of our rest of our dairies are in under the conditional waiver at this time, and they will be going into tier 2. So I was asked to talk a little bit in preparation for Nancy, talk a little bit about our grant program, which I think Jim will be able to answer questions if they come up later better than I. But in general, there is a grant program. It's funds that come from the Clean Water Act. It's from federal funds that are given to the states for projects, and specifically for non-point source projects. Last year, or this year, we got approximately a $4 million pot of money, and we've granted, usually the grants range between $250,000 and $800,000. They require a 25% match. And we award the grants to nonprofits, government agencies, or different groups doing projects, but not private entities. But the projects themselves can be on private lands or public lands. And one big criteria is that the projects that are funded can be for design, but also has to include implementation. So on the ground projects. on-the-ground changes is what the money is for. So, criteria. So in general, what happens is the PI money comes to the state, and each regional board, or people will give grant proposals to each regional board. Each regional board decides what their priorities are. And basically, the priorities are the TMDL watersheds, the watersheds that have impaired waters. So the projects have to fall within those watersheds, and then each regional board will rank and decide which projects they feel will have the most impact in their region. Within our region, past projects have been rangeland projects, they've been on dairies, they've been on equestrian facilities, on vineyards, restoration projects, remediation projects, and such. So mostly it's to implement the pathogen, TMDL, the nutrient TMDLs, and sediment TMDLs. This is just a slide that gives you an idea of how much, we're talking about a partnership with the park. There's been a lot of money that has been granted to the park, and as well they have matched. Over the years, it's a total almost $2 million. And these projects have ranged, just like we were talking before, fencing of animals out of streams, providing alternate water supply, stabilizing stream crossings, and repairing roads and gullies. What's interesting to point out is that there's a 25% match requirement. The park has matched over the years, probably closer to 50%, I think it is, 49%. So they put in quite a bit of money as well, but it's a good snapshot on where we've been. I think it leads into what Nancy's going to talk about is how she's used some of that money. So in summary, we have TMDLs and regulations that drive our permits. We've recently, in the past few years, we're focusing our efforts on communication and outreach to both new facilities, such as horse boarding operations, and also getting folks enrolled in the grazing program. We have our newly updated permits for confined animal facilities. This season is the start of the new launching program for the dairies. Like I said, we talked about horse boarding. We've just now, since our WDR was just adopted in June, we've just now sent out letters to folks in the Tomales Bay watershed that operate a horse boarding operation that they're going to have to get coverage. It's going to be kind of a tough sell, but we're going to have to get out there and kind of really educate some folks, and so we're hoping to coordinate with the counties, with the RCDs, with different groups to kind of pool the resources that we have and get the word out. And then finally, there's available grants for on-the-ground projects. So, and then I can just have our websites to have lots more information and everything that we covered here, and including the permits themselves. And if you call us anytime or email any questions.
Maybe one question for Lori, and then we'll go to our last speaker. At this point, please.
How many horses in your facility need to be covered by this?
So we don't have a limit, we don't have a threshold for the number of animals, because we're already just focusing on our impaired watersheds. It's not going to be any horse boarding facility anywhere in the region. So we know there's an issue, and it's obvious if you have a small facility next to a creek, that's going to be a higher threat than even a larger facility that isn't anywhere near a creek. So we don't have a threshold, but we do have the opportunity for an off-ramp. So if a facility thinks that they are too small or that they're managed in a way that they don't have, they don't have manure even contacting stormwater water at all, they haul everything off, they're not planning to land. Depending on how they're managing the site, where they're located, how many animals they have, they can apply for an exemption, and then we will determine if they meet certain criteria, and they can be out of the program.
No, please, go ahead.
One question you need to answer now or maybe when you're in the panel.
Sure.
But you got to kind of a really important last slide, which was the partnership with the park. And I think we all would be interested in getting a little further explanation of how that works, and so forth. So So maybe when you're.
Let's do that at the panel.
Yeah, but that's a question I think we all want to understand.
You're specifically asking about the grants and
The grant-
projects.
In the park, that's right.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
that's fine.
We've talked about it and getting ready, and we'll make sure we bring it up at the panel.
Okay.
Lori, thank you again. And I'll just pick up on that point of partnership. So we've been building this thread, and it takes a partnership to do this kind of work. And so the last person to come up is Nancy Scolari, who's the executive director for Marin's Resource Conservation District. She's part of that partnership that, I don't think it's her money, but she acts, her organization, which consists of an elected board. You should know that the RCD is basically a special district with an elected board. That board gives direction on what kinds of projects, what kinds of funding pursue, how to partner with the National Park Service on things. So we're just lucky to have Nancy, who's been the executive director for 18 years, and really can speak to us about how these projects happen, and we'll build on that partnership theme that Lori started and have Nancy carry that through. Nancy, thank you.
I already shake, so being in front of an audience will be just that much more worse. Okay, well, I'm really excited to be here. It's not often that I'm asked to talk about all the background around getting projects actually installed. And so I have a captive audience, and so I'm excited to share with you what that means. I decided to start with this photo. This is Joe Mendoza, who has passed, but I just think it's a great photo to start because it all starts with opening the gate and really seeing, what is happening out on the landscape and what can we do to make improvements. So, I'm starting with an interest. Usually when we have projects out there, we're working with ranchers or the park who are interested in doing something. So all of our programs are voluntary, and I think that's a huge part of our success. So you'll see a list of agricultural groups there. They have been pretty active through our few years of doing projects and actually guiding us in doing this work. They have partnered with a number of different agencies, and those are all listed there as well. I'm not going to go into the details, but what I wanted to show you is that map there shows you a bunch of triangles. And as a mass within the agricultural community, we do projects not just within the park, but outside the park. And that just shows kind of the cooperation and partnerships that exist in getting these projects done. And that's just an example of one project, so there are many more to actually report on. So the funding can be kind of tricky, so I was really glad to listen to Lori's presentation. For us, we had a study done by University of California Cooperative Extension looking at 50 years of our data and our projects. And this is what they came up with. The numbers are kind of fascinating. I've highlighted a couple boxes. The Lagunitas box represents folks within the Olima Valley. And then the Pacific Ocean, those are ranches draining out to the Pacific, out towards the peninsula. But what you'll see is that there's a kind of a discrepancy there in the numbers. There's this 6.4 million in Lagunitas versus 2.1 out towards the park. And it's interesting is that it's because there are higher priorities in Lagunitas Creek. That watershed is impaired, as Lori was talking about, and so it attracts a lot of funding from different agencies, and so you'll see the money trickling down and being represented in this way. However, we do have one agency that through time has been very consistent in funding projects regardless of the watershed, and that's been our local USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service office. We call them NRCS. So you'll see that the 1 million, the 1.8 million, they're consistent throughout, and so we're going to focus a little bit on their programs. I will also say that these are very competitive grant programs, and so we are constantly competing with other folks throughout the state, and I think we do pretty well for ourselves. Oh. There. All right, so this is how the money kind of turns into projects. So there's a difference between projects and practices. A project might be a creek project, a creek restoration project. However, within that, there might be a fence, there might be a water trough, a livestock crossing. Those are all practices that make the project whole. And so you'll see that those numbers are larger, but there have been quite a few projects over time, and this is over a 50-year period. That sort of translates over time into increases in plans and practices and projects, and then, of course, total cost. However, what's interesting about this is that after 1969, you see quite an increase. So what happens after 1969? Guesses? Clean Water Act, yes. So obviously the Clean Water Act made a big difference. All right, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how these projects get completed. I turned 25 steps into 10, so it can take anywhere from 3 months to a year or more to get some of these projects in. Once the interest is determined by the rancher or the park themselves, first step might be calling up the park. So, hey, I have a project in mind. You know, I have a fence I'd like to install, or I'd like a creek that I need a fence around, or a trough to put somewhere. Next would be a site visit. Then oftentimes we're looking for funding. So these projects can be rather expensive, and I can show you that later, but they might talk to us, they might talk to their local NRCS office, and those are cost shares. So the rancher is putting something in, and so is the park, or the funding agency. So then they get ranked. There's a whole ranking process. So there's selection criteria that we go through, and we give points, and so the highest priority projects often get selected. Then step 5, there's an internal review that occurs within the park itself. There's a project review team that vets every project. The photo off to the right isn't the park staff, it's our staff and our partners, but they have the very same thing happening for the park project. So at that table, you have an engineer, you have a rangeland ecologist, a biologist, you have a permit specialist. So everyone is represented, and they're all contributing to the planning process. Then we undergo the public review process. So then that would be, let's go through the National Environmental Protection Act, or if they're receiving state funding, it would go through the California Environmental Quality Act. And so you heard a little bit about that in the presentations earlier. That would then, that's a public process, so anyone can comment on that. That's posted online. Then they would go to get environmental permits. So fortunately in the park, they only have to really, I think, kind of look at 2 permits. When I started my job some years ago, I think the question was, will this project need a permit? And now the question is, how many permits will we need? So they have to go through sections 401 and 404 of the Clean Water Act, and those permits are obtained through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or the Water Quality Control Board. Then permits are secured from the park and their departments. The rancher is notified that they can proceed with the project itself, and they're given a list of mitigation measures that they have to follow as well. So, for example, if they're going to use equipment and move soil around, they got to put silt fences up or prepare for, say, a bird nesting season and things like that. And then they can finally construct. Very simple. Okay. So there are also, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Obviously, there are the lease and the permits. They're 22 pages plus. And they go through cyclical maintenance that has to be completed on the ranch. The agreements also detail out, as Frank was describing, the environmental and land management requirements. So that includes identifying stocking rates for cattle, residual dry matter, and monitoring that, integrated pest management, managing roads, ponds, etc. Then we go to non-point source pollution, and Lori covered that, so I won't go there, but there are a number of plans that must be completed as well. And then if they're actually receiving funding for the practice itself, then they would sign these other contracts through the NRCS or the RCD. And so those contracts, this is where it kind of gets a little sticky, because what happens is, say a ranch is in a lease, and they might be 3 years into the lease. Well, if they're also signing up for an NRCS contract, they're requiring that they have control of that land for 3 to 4 years during that contract period. So that can be a little bit difficult for them to make that commitment, especially if we have backlog of engineering in those departments, like 3 years. Last year, the backlog was 3 years. So, but projects must be designed by engineers, surveyed by biologists and archaeologists. They're inspected. They're agreeing to random spot checks. They also agree to 10 to 20-year operation, maintenance, repair, and replacement conditions. And so, for example, a fence might have a lifespan of 20 years. So they're expected to repair and replace that for that period of time. So then the practices are all described in great detail. There are binders of these practices that exist in an office in Petaluma. You can also look at them online. You can also find them online if you Google fence number 382. Up will pop a page like this, and you'll see a definition, a purpose, conditions, criteria. They go on for a while in terms of how this practice would actually be used. And they all have really funny names. So pumping plant means solar pump for a water trough, and roof runoff structure means gutter. So I don't know how they come up with these things, but that's kind of how it works. So here's some examples of the projects. Fencing number 382. So the purpose is, we got just out of that code that I just showed you, but this is an example of a project where you would put up a fence, you would have multiple practices, you would be planting trees, you would be putting in a livestock crossing. And this would be the crossing. And so I often get asked, why not a bridge? And the reason for that is because bridges cost about $100,000, and these crossings cost about $20,000. And so they're also not used all year round very, very often. So that would be the reason. What you would see in this case is a lot of times these fences actually come out during the winter season so that water can be conveyed upstream and downstream. But that would be an example of a stream crossing. And then this here is a water trough, very popular. We use this to move cattle around across the ranch in areas where sometimes they wouldn't otherwise go. But we use it to get them out of the riparian corridor. Once it's fenced off, the cows need somewhere else to drink. And so this is an example of that. Does anyone know what the black thing is there?
Wildlife.
Yes, that is perfect. Yes, it is a wildlife ramp. So that is practice number 649. So that is put in there so that critters can get out of the swimming pool, basically, and not drown. So birds, bats, frogs, lizards, what have you. So that's just an example of how these are constantly evolving. 5 years ago, this wasn't required, but now it is. And so there you have it. Here is an example of a practice that can be costly. This is where the cost share becomes really important for ranchers. If you were at the second workshop, you would have heard a guy talk about the average income being 30 to 40,000 for a rancher. This costs about 30 to 40,000. So this is where they really do use those incentive payments. So now we have various ways of monitoring the success of our projects, but in this particular case, we have this great partnership with Cornish National Seashore, UC Extension, UC Davis. They're looking at water monitoring. They're looking at projects pre and post implementation. They're looking at 50 conservation practices, and their data is not complete yet, but they are monitoring trends over time. This is what all the sampling looks like. Every single circle represents a sample, and on the left-hand side you see fecal coliform counts and then over time. But what you'll see there, pre and post project, your pre and post project, is a 60% reduction of coliform. So it shows rather promising results. They've also monitored nutrients. 100% of the samples met drinking water standards for nutrients. They're also measuring reductions in pathogen concentrations, sediment concentrations. But also what's on here, and you can't really see it, but it is very important, the gray dots and the black dots represent background sites, so control sites. So those are sites where there is no grazing. So that's important information to capture as well. And our numbers are pretty close to those comparing sites as well. There's also other things that kind of come into play. We're realizing that, UC Extension is realizing that downstream in the watershed, the lower you go, the higher the numbers get. So there are obviously other factors contributing to that, and they're adding sites to that, to the watershed so that they can analyze those results as well. So moving forward, I was really excited to hear about the soils talk from Joe, because that's where we're headed. We're headed to carbon farming and the Healthy Soils Initiative. The state is really pushing right now, and a lot of that research has been conducted here. And we have this very interested ranching community throughout the county, and so that's really exciting for us to see people support that. We're also, in this next year, we have a rangeland specialist coming on board who's going to help ranches update their ranch water quality plans. So if you're a rancher out there and you need that help, come see us. The dairies are, as you heard earlier, will be putting together these sets of plans, some cases just updating plans. There will be a workshop on that coming up, so if you're a dairy, please see me after this. I have a flyer for that. And then, of course, as we go on, the RCD is always interested in finding ways how we can incentivize this kind of work. How can we get more of it out there? How do we streamline the permitting process? Not get rid of it, but just streamlining it so it can support more of this work. And then, of course, supporting the ranchers in their maintenance and monitoring provisions. And then funding. We always have a waiting list of people who want to do projects, but we just don't have enough funding to go around. So that's my summary. Thank you.
So is there anything specific for Nancy at this stage? And then we're going to bring up all four folks together. Well, why don't we do that then? Let's have Nancy have you go on down the end. Lori, come on up. Joe, Frank, please take a seat. Great. So you guys aren't blinded. Or let's ask you guys to share those 3 mics back and forth. And folks, we started just a little late. We're going to try this one again. Okay, I'll use this one. Okay, so is this working for everybody? I don't hear myself yet. Okay. So we started a little bit late, so we've got 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes to visit with our panelists. I want to thank you all again for being here. As Frank said, we know it's an important night if you're a Giants fan. But let's start maybe where Nona asked us to, and it was a question I had, and I'd love for you to expand on this where you could. I think, Frank, you mentioned there's a range management staff, and I think I saw on Nancy's slide, call Dylan. I think they're the same person.
Yes.
So maybe between Lori and Nancy and Frank, just hit a little bit on how do you work together, and when the regional board comes out, how are they working with park staff, and same with the RCD?
I'll start maybe. I think just over the years, things have gotten a lot more professionalized. It used to be just the park rangers out there kind of talking to the ranchers that were in the park and working with them. They would meet, periodically. And as Joe indicated, there's been a lot more knowledge gained since the 90s on the resources at risk in the park, or resources that are thriving for that matter. And then outside agencies such as the Regional Water Quality Control Board and other groups that, are interested in what's going on inside the park, since it is, a special place. So the range management specialists were hired beginning, I think, in the late 80s and up until now. And so that was someone with that professional background and training, education, that could really converse more professionally with the rancher and understand their needs, because the rangers typically, some had a more biological background, but they didn't have the training to understand grazing and ranching. So I think it's worked better, and those folks that have been in that position they can communicate with the RCD as well. They just sort of speak the language and understand all those abbreviations, and both from a natural science standpoint, but also from a range management standpoint. So, and I know one of the goals of that position is to facilitate the partnership and the streamline the permit processes so that the ranchers are doing the best that they can do and working with funding opportunities.
Well, I think for us, what we try to do is, first of all, when we are receiving funding from the Water Board, they are intimately involved with the selection of projects. So we actually have them out evaluating the projects with us. On a monthly basis, we convene our team that I showed you that photo of, and if there are projects in the park is included in that team. So that happens frequently. So, there are partnerships happening, in the selection of projects, but also in the planning, the permitting, the designing, the implementation, the monitoring, all aspects of the project, basically.
And I'd have to agree with all those things, both what they said, but Jim might be able to speak more specifically about our grant program and how we've partnered with the park and implementing grants. But I know as far as implementing the CAF program and the grazing program, we are going to be enforcing our permits. We don't expect the park to enforce our permits, but we do work cooperatively with them, in that sometimes they may be there during an inspection so that they can understand what is going on a ranch, or maybe what improvements need to be made. I've often heard from ranchers, we have improvement projects that we're doing and we have planned, but we do have to get approval from the park before we proceed. So it's important to have the conversation, and I also call Dylan and ask him to see how things are going. And more recently, I think Dylan will be more involved with monitoring out there with the ranches that are in the park, because the group monitoring, I think they're going to be having their own group. So he'll be probably intimately involved with implementing some sort of monitoring program to show compliance with the dairy waiver.
I might ask you all to touch on a question and really a thread that Joe started with, and I think Nancy ended, and that's the emphasis on soils. How does that play a role in what we're trying to achieve on the seashore with the ranchers and the park staff?
Oh, I'm so excited about soils. So I think what's exciting about it is that we have, in time, as you can see, put quite a bit of emphasis on our wetlands and riparian areas, and of course, that has been very important. But that has been a little to the neglect of our rangelands and our pastures, and that's all part, as Joe was talking about, of a whole ecological system. And so the ranchers really understand pastures, and they really understand soils. And so we're really excited to kind of get into that and support that, because I think that's been a missing piece for us. And so, so looking forward, I'd really like to see that, we sent out a sign up for folks interested in developing carbon plans. We received 20 applicants. We were able to support 12 of them right now. However, we don't have we can't proceed with projects in the park yet because they haven't vetted the management plan. So we'd love to see that happen.
Any thoughts or you want to add, Joe, or your emphasis on soils?
I don't have anything much more to say than what I already said about soil.
Very good. Okay. Let's go ahead and open it up. I think I've got John, and then we'll see who else.
I'll chime in on soil, and this I think is for Joe. If you made it a goal to take a given piece of northern coastal prairie and say, I'm going to try to build some reasonable analog to what was there before, would it be a feasible thing to get back those extremely deep-rooted communities, for instance, and what steps would be required?
Well, the perennial grasses do well in this area because of the fog. And what tipped the scales back when it all started was a lot more intensive grazing than of course that occurs today. And so it would be finding that balance between the allowing the vigor of the plants to be able to provide enough mulch to remain sustainable. So it would be finding that balance between grazing pressure and time. So that's what the studies have found with the changes between when Europeans came in and before. And they've been able to do this by studying particular areas and how they came back at various rates by easing off on those pressures.
And how about if I can be greedy, and how about the grip of the exotic species that get in the way? How could you break that?
It's from what I can gather, it would be very difficult. But that would be the key, is doing that. I think you probably have to you'd have to provide some energy coming in from the human side, I think, to help the perennials along. Yeah, because you're right. That would be the foundational problem is being able to assist them in getting their place back.
You, Dean, said that the range program was a liaison between the park, the Park Service and the ranchers. And I'm a botanist, and I didn't hear anyone say anything about special status species, plant species. Talked a lot about water issues. But my question is, what might be the consequence for a rancher if it was determined that there are negative impacts from grazing on the special status species on his land, actually?
So Frank, let me just again explain it. I think your question's perfect, and ask Frank to respond and give you an explanation. But as you remember, his slide listed a number of environmental regulations that are required in terms of how the Park Service has to comply with them. We did dive into water quality. We could do a whole nother 2 hours on threatened and endangered species. So your question's absolutely relevant. We just had to choose one for time's sake, so that's why. But Frank, please.
Many of the endangered and threatened endangered species that I mentioned, kind of mentioned quickly, but they are plants. So it's a tough question, an issue to deal with. But the rangers and the range management specialists know where the the special populations of plants are now, and they're often protected either by fencing or by grazing, very tight monitoring of the grazing regimen or amount of grazing that occurs. As these ecosystems have evolved with range and grazing, one of the things that we've learned is if you pull the cows off, if you think, oh, I'm going to do the right thing, pull the cows out of this endangered population of plants, it can actually cause harm. Other invasive species encroach. So there's sort of a delicate balance, but they do really monitor those populations very carefully now. In some cases, they have backed off on the grazing altogether. In other cases, it's, toned down. So I hope that answers the question.
Are you saying that an area could be fenced off in perpetuity?
In some cases it is, but, again, they have to determine if that's the right cause. Sometimes it's not. They don't want to take that risk. If it's the only one or two populations in the park or in West Marin, if you pull the cows off, brush will come in or something like that. So it's not always an on-off switch. It can be problematic. I don't know, Nancy, if
Frank,
you want to.
take a minute though and explain a little more about staffing. We've talked about the rangeland staffing, but there's other units and other types of staffing.
So in the mid-90s, the park really staffed up from the resource management specialists. So there's range management specialists, which is 2 people. The resource management team is probably 15 or more people that are out in the park, and they're the ones that are looking not just at the rangeland, the pastoral zone, but also throughout the park for sensitive species and water quality and so forth. So it was a big investment that the park made to professionalize that whole cadre. Before, as I said, it was just the rangers that would be patrolling, and they might have a wildlife specialist, but it was not anywhere near as disciplined and professional as it is now. And that also was complemented by the listing of salmon species in the mid-90s. And so we have fisheries and Fish and Wildlife and those agencies that are monitoring things that go on in the park as well, in the creeks.
We have a question.
Please. Yes, I wanted to follow up with Eva's question, and I think maybe for you, Frank. I've had a little experience using grazing as a management tool to encourage native plants, particularly special status plants. My experience has been that there's been a conflict between commercial needs of the rancher and the biological needs. That, for instance, when we have a drought situation, that's the time when the rancher really needs forage. But it's really the time when we have to pull off the cattle to protect the native species. In a situation like the ranches out in Point Reyes, where you do have commercial operations and you have a commitment to keep those operations viable, how do you deal with that conflict?
And Frank, I'll just reiterate and let you form your answer. If you were at the second workshop, you heard about drought responses from ranchers, including reduction of herd size, directly from ranchers on the park, but go ahead.
So I know the park monitors these areas constantly. They're full-time employees. And I know that each year they do check at the end of the grazing season, the residual dry matter and so forth, to determine the rates and how it went. What I don't know, I missed the second workshop, so what I don't know is that drought question specifically, because if you're, in mid-year and you realize that there was a lousy rainfall season in the summer, I don't know how they pivot or adjust, so maybe you can answer that, or Nancy.
One of the responses is you ship early. You actually move your herd off of the range early. And Nancy, go ahead.
How is that decision made?
On the park, I don't know how it's made.
Yeah, I mean, the park ultimately has the final say, but obviously it is sensitive if the rancher has a stocking rate that he had agreed to, or the park had agreed to in the permit and at the beginning of the year. But Nancy, I don't know if you have some personal experiences or anecdotes, but
I don't have personal experience of what happens in the park, but I will just say that, we are trying to, in certain cases where it's possible, is get back to those native perennials that are those deep-rooted native perennials, because then that sort of makes our pastures more climate resilient, so able to withstand longer periods of drought. And so where that opportunity exists, we like to promote that. And so that's why the sort of the push from the state around the Healthy Soils Initiative is really important, and the refocusing in on our pasture management is really important.
Let's take one more. So David.
I'm trying to craft this question, but, because I don't mean it in any way to challenge what we're trying to do here, because it's unbelievably important that this nexus of human effect on the natural environment. But I am struck by the acronyms and the number of steps and the different practices and how all of that devolves onto ranchers to somehow do the applications and do all the work needed to get these grants going and to comply. And some of the agencies can hire new people. I know your budgets are constricted too, so it's challenging, but and there are grants providing resources to the ranchers to help them do this. But I'm just wondering, and I'm not sure the panel here is able to respond to this, but what is the just the workload to apply and go through all of the meetings and the steps and such for the ranchers themselves? And how, is there any support? And I'm sure you all help them out as much as you can around filling things out and what are the next steps and making the appointments and all that. But I'm just struck by how big an effort it seems like it must require.
Who'd like to start?
So David is probably really good at answering this too. But there are quite a few resources for the dairies in particular. It is a big workload. I have to agree with you. And we've tried over the years. I mean, the dairies have been active for many, many years and protecting water quality and complying with the state regulations. And in 2003, we started our more rigorous permitting program. So since 2003, they've done a lot of work on their properties and a lot of planning. We also have what's called the California Dairy Quality Assurance Program, which is a statewide assistance program. It's basically an educational program, and it has different sectors to it, but one of the sectors is environmental compliance. And they put together, it's a partnership between all the agencies and the RSUDs and UC Cooperative Extension and academia, and we put together educational workshops. They come and help them do their calculations for their ponds. They provide a environmental certification program where once you get through the program, you can come and have an inspection done and be certified that you're meeting all the environmental regulations for the state. So there are programs like that for the dairies. There aren't that many for non-dairy facilities currently. Now that we've expanded our program in our region, not all the regions have done this, but we're starting to expand to different types of animals. We're hoping to develop similar programs for those kinds of sectors.
Frank. Yeah, I'm going to ask Frank quickly. Maybe this will get to your question, Nona. Frank, how does the park either write or hold those plans for the rancher and work with the rancher? Did my question make sense?
Yeah, I'm a little rusty on it, to be honest with you, so I'm not really sure what the latest and greatest versions of that are.
Sure, but and maybe Lori help us too. If I understand it right, the Park Service submits the annual report on behalf of the rancher. Is that correct? And then again, Frank, going back to the transition between rights of use into special permits, writing individual ranch plans started, did it not? And how has that evolved over time?
So I'm not quite sure, actually, what the involvement is with Park Service with doing the annual reporting and actually the planning processes on each ranch. I do know that the Park Service is on the notice of intent, which is the application form, as the landowner. So in legal terms, they are just as responsible for compliance as the rancher is, because it's their land. The permit, it's both. Right. In our case, it's both. They're both held responsible. The rancher as the operator of the ranch and the Park Service as the landowner.
But go ahead, Nancy. I want to still have Frank answer about the ranch
Okay.
plans.
That language is also contained in their leases as well, that they have to be in compliance with all environmental laws, and so they've got to do it. And you're right, it is a lot of work. I mean, and that's just the environmental side of things, let alone organic certification and those sorts of things. And ranching, right. Dairy health, I mean, and any dairy operator will talk about how many plants they have sitting on their shelf that they look at and update regularly. So is there enough of us to go around to do the work? No, there really isn't. Is there demand? Yes, there's definitely demand. We always, like I said, have a waiting list, but there's only so much staff to go around because we don't expect them to be environmental experts with CEQA and permitting and 401 and 404, and if you're outside the park, there are more. And so it can be kind of bearing, so.
Okay, so what's the question again?
Can you explain a little bit of the start of the ranch plans individually for each ranch, when the transition from rights of use into special use permits and how that evolved over time?
So when the ranches were purchased by the park beginning in the 1960s, the ranchers that owned the property had a reservation of use for 20 to 25 years. So that was part of the sale, that they could stay on the property and continue to ranch. When that term expired, that's when the park started developing lease permits. They didn't do a pure lease would be open to competition, and there was the feeling at the time that they wanted to retain the historic families to the extent possible on the farms that they owned and had built, the ranches they had built. So they call them lease permits, and so those were 20 years, and they're actually renewable up to 20 years. So those were the first sort of more professional, I would say, documents that started to incorporate resource management thinking and professional range management thinking into the terms and conditions. Now, each year, the park sits down with those ranchers and goes over the priorities for the year, whether they be opportunities for funding, for fencing or erosion control, water quality improvements, things like that. So those are all incorporated in the annual plans, sort of a work plan that they sit around the kitchen table with the rancher and go over that and come up with those projects. So, and then we're now, as sort of the underlying, I guess, underpinnings of these ranch workshops we have is the next iteration of these lease permits. How do they get implemented and how they get described and written is, I guess, where we are today at this juncture. Yeah.
So hopefully none of that addresses how it's different on the park. I'm actually going to ask us to wrap up. I'm going to ask each of the panel members just to be forward-looking for a minute. And Joe, you challenge us with a number of different things to focus on: soils, thinking about roots. But using the title of tonight's talk, I really appreciate the background, the context, and where we've gotten to today. I've learned a lot. But I'd like you to just kind of look forward, and I'm curious your perspectives and visions for what protecting the land and the ranch is in the future.
I think it's difficult to say because I see a lot of movement forward regionally, but I'm really concerned globally, and I'm not so sure how all that's going to dovetail together. There's going to be some significant changes. There's no doubt they're already occurring, and we try to kind of put them on the shelf and not think about them too much. But it seems to me as it would be really prudent to try and nip them in the bud as much as possible and start thinking about those changes now. And wherever we're connecting with the natural world, it's going to be significant because we're a species of stability if you think about us and just how we've been able to become who we are biologically and how we've connected with the planet. And with these changes, I think my advice would be to start taking into consideration how we're going to mitigate and deal with these changes that are on the horizon that's closer than we thought. If I was to summarize importance, that's where I would start.
Try Frank or Lori?
Well, I think as we've said, it's a complex situation that has evolved out there. It's become much more professional as far as the park, and as far as their staffing and their expertise. And the ranching families as well are much more knowledgeable about good practices, particularly with the next generation of children returning to the farms and ranches with their college educations and training in a professional way. So I think it's gotten a lot better. I think sometimes the park is seen as maybe being leaning too far one way or the other, but ranching doesn't occur a lot and grazing doesn't occur a lot in national parks. So, but I think the Park Service, I can say this now, I think they look at this Point Reyes as a special case and it's a special place, and no one is trying to do anything, rush to judgment or get rid of ranching or expand ranching. So I think it's a balance that they see, and I think with the way that it has become more professionalized, I think that we're, I say we, but I think the park is trying to get it right as far as how the grazing would continue to occur in the park and dairying for that matter as well. And I think the fact that many of the ranches have, the dairies have gone organic is a good sign, and for a lot of reasons, as far as best practices, but it also provides greater economic return for the farmers and the ranchers, which makes it more tenable for them to stay on under the right conditions.
I'll give it a shot. Not sure. As far as the future, I'm a regulator, and a water quality regulator, so I'm actually quite hopeful. We have new permits in place. We've tried to make them as workable and practical as possible, and at the same time be protective of water quality and enforce what laws are already on the books. We've worked closely with stakeholders and Western United Dairymen folks and academic folks to try to really get it right, so that once the ranchers really know, okay, this is what we need to do, this is where we're going, you get your plans in place, I'm very hopeful that you'll see they're doing a lot already, and that if there are improvements to be made, that they'll be made, and that they'll be planned out in a practical way, in a way that's feasible financially. And we're willing to work with ranchers in the future. We're willing to work with other stakeholders as well to get things done and to help funding for projects, special projects if need be, and to be reasonable in implementing what's required. So looking forward, I'm quite hopeful. I know that the ranchers want to be good stewards of the land, and we think that it's possible for ranching and the environment to be also protected at the same time. So.
I would love to see ranchers be supported in the implementation of practices in a much easier way. A list of common practices that they can be, they know they have a support from staff in implementing. They know what kind of a timeline to expect. And I don't think this is just for folks in the park, but outside the park as well. I think ranches everywhere should be supported in any sort of environmental improvements that they would like to make, or any sort of land conservation improvements that are necessary. And to be in compliance with water quality laws, or to improve upon endangered species or what have you. So anything that would streamline that process would be wonderful. I mean, I am in the middle of it, and it is already difficult, and I'm supposed to be an expert. So it takes a while for us to vet through all the steps that must be taken, and so It would just be great to somehow create a program where this was already vetted in advance, or whether that means hiring another Dylan or some other staff. But I think that there are some opportunities to facilitate this kind of work in the future.
So on behalf of the Marine Conservation League, let me thank you all for coming. Let me ask you to join us outside and visit. There's many of the ranchers and other members of the community here tonight. You've had a chance to visit over the last 2 workshops. Please join and continue those conversations you started then. Join us October 25th at Nicasio Valley School for the 4th workshop. And please join me in thanking our panelists.